So, first of all, Martin, we'll just ask about you. So, how have the past 3 or 4 months been?
Well, first, let me say I'm glad to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me. I'm based in Cambridge and I have a home here. And so I've been sort of guiltily happy in a sense, in that being locked down, if you don't have small kids and have a reasonably nice house and garden, has in fact been not particularly unpleasant. And I've been getting quite a bit of work done, although frustrating not to have enough real social contact. So I'm one of the lucky ones, but of course, those who've had a hard time are obviously those who are cooped up in small apartments, maybe with kids, and maybe insecure in having jobs that they can't do from home and have therefore lost. So it's been a huge hardship for many people, but I think I have to accept that I and most of my colleagues who I work with here are the lucky ones.
In 2002, you said the following: by 2020, bioterror or bioerror will lead to 1 million casualties in a single event. Now, when you said that, did you have a pandemic in mind?
Yes, I did, because I was writing this and I amplified this a bit in my later book on the future. I realized that it's very easy for a new virus to mutate or to spread, and it's very hard to cope with. And in our interconnected world, with even more air travel now than there was 15 or 20 years ago, it can spread around the world within a few days and therefore could cause this. So indeed, I did expect some sort of pandemics. In fact, in my book, I was being even more scary because I was thinking that these might be engineered to be more virulent by malefactors of various kinds. And indeed, it is the case that for the last 7 or 8 years, it's been possible to make the influenza virus more virulent or more transmissible within the lab. And I was worried about this sort of thing happening. Unfortunately, that can't yet be done with the coronavirus, although it's still possible that it leaked out of a lab in China, but it's more likely that it was a natural transmission from animals to humans. But of course, it has been catastrophic. And what is new about this is that it has spread globally at a speed which could never have happened in previous generations.
And do you think the coronavirus has demonstrated to us that governments, in terms of risk management, they allocate their resources in the wrong place? So we spend an awful lot of money on terrorism and nuclear deterrence. Do you think it's the case that governments have overlooked biological threats?
I think it is the case, and also other kinds of threats like massive cyber attacks on the electricity grid and things of this kind, which are growing in probability. And I indeed think that the amount that governments should spend on scenario exploration to decide which are the serious threats, which can be dismissed, and preparing properly against the serious ones is an important priority, and is not being done enough. And in particular, we weren't particularly prepared for this pandemic. We had prepared for influenza pandemics, vaccines, etc., but not for this. And we hadn't stocked up on appropriate protective clothing and all that sort of thing. And I think no one could have said that this pandemic was highly improbable. It's an important mantra that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And I think given that there had been the SARS and the MERS pandemic, and of course AIDS before that, no one could have been surprised at a pandemic of this kind. Most people would have expected that within 10 or 20 years we would have it. And that being so, if you think of how you work out an insurance premium by multiplying the probability of an event by its impact, and that decides how much you're prepared to pay in an insurance premium. If you'd done that in this context, you'd have come up with a huge number, hundreds of billions of dollars probably, and the amount we spent on preparedness was tiny compared to that. The world should have spent that. And of course, some people would worry that it might be all wasted. But you've got to accept that. If your house doesn't burn down, you don't think you've wasted your fire insurance. And we don't think we've wasted our expenditure on defense because there hasn't been a war this year. So in the same spirit, I think it would have been appropriate to have spent more on being more prepared for this kind of virus. And indeed, we shouldn't, as it were, prepare for the last one. We should be preparing for other kinds of threats. And among those, I would include massive cyber failures or cyber attacks, which could knock down the electricity grid in a large region, for instance.
And what have you made of the UK government's handling of the coronavirus? And speaking as a scientist, when you look at other countries across the world, what do you think has been the features that have remarked a successful response to the pandemic?
Well, I think everyone would accept now that the lockdown should have been a week or two sooner, and that would have made a big difference in the number of serious infections. I think, to be fair to the scientists, they started off not really knowing very much about the nature of the virus, so any advice they gave was obviously tentative, and there were disagreements, but that's to be expected. And it is right to say that the government does have to take account of the science advice, but does have other criteria as well. And in the context of science advice, in all contexts, and I've been involved in this world for quite a long time, the scientific advice is a part of the decision background, but so also are economic, ethical, and political constraints as well. So the politicians do have to make decisions, even in the face of uncertainty, taking into account the science, but also taking into account other things like the economy, etc.
And do you think the coronavirus has shown us that science is fundamentally political? So the Daily Mail branded Neil Ferguson, the famous Imperial College scientist, they called him Professor Lockdown because of that study that came out that suggested that 500,000 would die if herd immunity was pursued further. Do you think it's the case that science and politics have become inseparable?
Well, it's certainly true that political decisions very often involve some assessment of scientific issues. I mean, that's true of this. It's true of energy policy. It's true of climate policy. And it's true of transport policy, for instance, where there are scientific criteria. But as I was saying, they're only part of the picture, and the politicians have to take account of the science, which is often very uncertain, but also other things as well. So I certainly don't think one can blame Neil Ferguson, because he said what his assumptions were, and if you make some assumptions, you predict a particular outcome.
And you're discussing on the future a great deal about the limitations of science. So are you optimistic that a vaccine will be generated for this?
Well, I'm completely unqualified to offer an opinion, so I just listen to what people say. And I think there is not tremendous optimism, but there is hope of some sort of palliative treatment, whether it's something to minimize the effects of the infection, or better still, some sort of virus. But then there's the issue of how long it gives you immunity, etc. But I think one has to admire the huge effort of scientific groups around the world, more than 100, which are trying to look for a virus. And I think this is a very welcome development. And I think the scientific community has done a very good job in this crisis.
You're saying on the future that we're deep in the Anthropocene. Do you think
Yeah.
the coronavirus has been the first pandemic of the Anthropocene?
It has, in a sense, in that it's the first which is truly global. We've had pandemics in the past, some even more serious, like the Black Death, of course, bubonic plague in the 14th century. But if you'd lived in Australia, you wouldn't have had any consequences of that. Whereas now it's possible for something to spread globally in a few days. But think about the Anthropocene. I discuss in my book really two things which are special about this century. It's the first where we are collectively, as a species, having effects on the entire biosphere, because there are a lot of us, 7.5 billion or more now, population growing, and all more demanding of energy and resources. So for the first time, we are collectively using up resources, causing mass extinctions potentially, and changing the climate. And that's something which has never happened. No one species had control over the planet's future in that sense. So that's one thing. And the second way in which this century is special is that technology is so powerful that it can empower small groups to create some effects that could cascade globally. And one example is an engineered bioweapon. Another example is a cyber attack on the financial system or things like that. So there are two categories of threats which are new this century. One is threats caused by us collectively, and the other is threats which mean that we can imagine a few individuals who can cause an effect to cascade globally. And this latter, incidentally, is a big challenge to governance because, as I like to say, the global village will have its village idiots, and they will now have a global range. And therefore, we can't accept the risk of malefactors having a chance to act. And this produces a growing tension between three things we want to preserve: privacy, security, and freedom. And I think, you know, if you're in China, the first one you give up is privacy, you know, and the balance between those three may be done differently in other parts of the world. But I think it's clear that since the fact that people with technical expertise and evil intent can cause a global catastrophe is a new fact. That is going to affect the extent to which we can allow privacy and allow clandestine efforts to take place unnoticed. So there's a big challenge for governance.
How likely do you feel that a pandemic disease more virulent than COVID-19 will spread in the next 100 years?
Well, I mean, I won't put an exact figure, but it can't be ruled out. One could imagine a natural pandemic which had a higher fatality rate than COVID-19. And of course, we can't rule out engineered pandemics, which could clearly be worse if you could combine the virulence of some really serious disease like Ebola with the transmissibility of influenza, for instance. We can't rule that out. And so that goes back to what we were saying earlier, that it's important to prepare for these things as much as we can.
And we'll move on to some of the themes that you talk about on the future. I'll just go through a few of the threats and we'll ask you about them. So one of the classic threats that we've always fretted about is asteroid collision. Now, how likely is that to be destructive compared to some of the other threats that we face?
Well, it's very unlikely. I mean, because I'm an astronomer, people always ask me about that. But we can actually calculate that because we know enough about how many asteroids there are and how they're moving to calculate this threat. And it's got a very small probability. It might happen. We know it wiped out the dinosaurs, and smaller ones, smaller asteroids impact once per century. But it's a small threat. It's worth spending some effort to try and mitigate the threat. And indeed, it will be possible later this century to actually identify smallish asteroids that could destroy a city. And if they're heading for the Earth, to deflect them or destroy them. That will be possible. But the main point is that the probability of these events is not getting any larger. It's the same now as it was 1 million years ago, more or less. Whereas the threats that we worry about are the human-induced ones, which are very risky now, but didn't exist maybe a century ago. So I don't worry much about asteroids, although we can do something to reduce this already rather small probability.
you think it's fair to say that the greatest threat to humanity is humanity itself?
Absolutely. Biggest risks are from humanity. And of course, this started with the nuclear age. And one point I make in my book is that if we look back on the Cold War era, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, then we were under really great threats, because if you read the memoirs of McNamara and people like that, they said that the chances of a nuclear exchange by error or by design during that period was not small. In fact, Kennedy said at the time of Cuba crisis that it was between 1 in 3 and evens. And McNamara in his memoirs said that to avoid catastrophe, we were lucky as well as wise. And so that's a very severe risk that we were under then. And incidentally, because I'm old enough to have lived through most of that period, and I think it would be interesting to ask if people really knew how significant the chance was, would they have still accepted the policy of mutually assured destruction? I would not. I mean, I would not have accepted a 1 in 3 chance of destroying the fabric of European civilization, or even a 1 in 6 chance, even if the alternative was a certain takeover of Europe by the Soviet Union. And I suspect many people would have reacted the same way. So I think most people were complacent about how big that risk was. And it wasn't just of miscalculations, as could have happened at the time of Cuba, but also there have been a number of later documented instances of false alarms, etc., that could have led to disaster. So we were really under very great threat at that time. The threat of nuclear disaster, as bad as could have happened in the Cold War, is in abeyance now, because the number of nuclear weapons is down by about a factor of 10 from what it was in the Cold War. At that time, it was about 70,000 on either side. Now it's about 7,000. Still catastrophic, but not quite as bad. But of course, there are now more nuclear powers. And so I would say the chance of some kind of nuclear exchange being a regional catastrophe, India and Pakistan or Middle East or North Korea, etc., that's probably higher than the chance of a nuclear catastrophe in the past, but it wouldn't be global in the way it would have been if we'd had such an exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. So the nuclear threat is in abeyance, and it could, of course, re-emerge, because we could have a new standoff between new superpowers handled less well or less luckily than the Cold War was. So let's not forget that that was the first case where technology gave humans the ability to destroy their civilization. But we now have these other ways, due to bio and cyber, of causing massive destruction. And the reason these are particularly threatening is that they don't involve huge, massive facilities which you can monitor and verify compliance with treaties, etc., because bio and cyber can be done using very familiar and widely available facilities. So it's very, very hard, as I said, without intruding on privacy and liberty to cut these risks down.
You touched on it a bit there. So I'll ask you a question about politics. So how threatening are the growing geopolitical conflicts, so America and China, the West and Russia?
Well, I mean, I think relations are at a low if we think over the last 20 or 30 years, and we just have to hope for competent leadership. And the worry we have now is that we can't rely very much on the leadership. So I think it is threatening, but and the risk is that things cascade. And of course, the special risk now is that things can happen much faster. World War III would be over in a few hours if it happened.
Indeed. So we've talked about it in relation to the virus, but yeah, you say we're deep in the Anthropocene in the book.
Mhm.
So I want to ask you a critical question. Do you think that the term's slightly redundant in that not all of humanity is equally affected by the catastrophic effects of living in the Anthropocene, and not all of humanity has made an equal contribution to its
Well,
manifestation? Yeah.
that's absolutely true, because I mean, technology has not only produced huge benefits, without which we couldn't feed 7.5 billion people, but it also led to these new threats. And of course, it's some countries and some segments of society which have contributed to this. And of course, this is very much an issue in the context of climate change, when the industrial countries have made the main contribution, and therefore have a special obligation to offer a solution, whereas countries like India have contributed far less per capita to this massive long-term problem. So the answer is that contributions have been very unequal between different parts of the world, and of course within each country they've been very unequal.
And what would you say to people on matters of climate change who say it's just simply too late?
Well, I think that's not true. I mean, there's a bigger risk the longer we wait of some sort of tipping point that will lead to massive irreversible changes, but it's certainly not too late. And my view on climate change is that we ought to have a massive program in technology to accelerate the development of cheap, carbon-free sources of energy. And I would include fourth generation nuclear in this. And the reason I say this is that the quicker we can develop these so that they become cheap enough for, say, India to afford, then this will make a big difference to the global CO2 emissions and make them fall, because India has every reason to want to have more energy per capita than it now has, and they will build coal-fired power stations, which is for them a plus compared to smoky stoves burning wood and dung in homes. But if they can leapfrog directly to clean energy, just as they've leapfrogged directly to mobile phones and never had landlines, then of course this will be better for them and better for the world. And one of the things I've been banging on about in the UK, and insofar as I've been involved in science politics here, is we ought to have a really massive program of R&D into better forms of clean energy. The reason I say that is that even if we meet our targets of zero net emissions by 2050, which is actually quite a challenge, then that will only make between 1% and 2% difference to the world's CO2 emissions, because that's the proportion that we're now emitting. We can actually make far more difference to reducing the world's CO2 emissions if we can develop very efficient new kinds of energy generation, which can be adopted by countries like India and Africa, so that they can develop without following our route of producing massive CO2 emissions. So I put that this country produces 1% of the world's CO2 emissions, roughly speaking, but it can aspire to produce far more than 1% of the world's clever innovations. And if we focus on doing that, then we can help to develop clean energy in collaboration, of course, with the scientists in those countries. And it's hard to think of a more inspiring goal for young technologists than to provide clean and affordable energy for the developing world. So we shouldn't be pessimistic, but we should say that although you could say technology has caused some of our problems, the answer to most problems is not less technology, it's more but better directed technology.
So is it the case that you're in favor of nuclear power?
I'm not against it. I think it's true that there are risks of nuclear power, but the designs now being adopted date back to the 1960s. And I certainly think there's a case for doing more research and development into the whole variety of fourth generation nuclear power, including in particular what's called small modular reactors, which could be produced, mass produced, and then moved around on a lorry and etc. 100 megawatts typically, and these could be more efficient and one could deal with the radiation better. So I think the point is that since there's been a stagnation in building nuclear power stations, there's been no new ideas really for the last 30 years or so. And so I don't think it should be dismissed, and I don't think fusion should be dismissed. So the point is that we need to have some way of supplementing unsteady sources of energy like wind and sun with some kind of base load which can work all the time, or massive storage. So nuclear is one option as a base load, which is there all the time. The other option, of course, is massive storage with huge numbers of batteries or making hydrogen, etc. So all these ideas. But I think we should not rule out nuclear.
And how plausible is geoengineering?
Well, I mean, it's plausible technologically, and it's rather scary as it is, because it will be possible for one nation or even one corporation to change the world's climate if it really wanted to, for a cost of a few $1 billion. And this would have some effects, but I think this would be a dangerous innovation, because we don't understand the climate enough to be able to fully predict the consequences, because it's not just a matter of the world being a sort of homogeneous sphere and the temperature just goes up, etc. The headline temperature rise, 1.5 or 2 degrees, is just an index for massive changes in weather patterns across the world. And of course, the temperature rise is much higher in polar regions than the average. And so what we don't know, simply because it's too difficult to calculate, is what the consequences would be of tinkering with the climate in particular ways. And certainly it will be very risky to do any geoengineering until we had a much better understanding of what the impacts would be. And at the moment, I don't think we could be confident of what they were. So that's a reason why we should put the brakes on this for the moment. But you can imagine scenarios when this could be necessary. And to take one futuristic example, one thing which would be probably safe would be to put lots of sunshades up in space to block out 2% of the sun's light or something like that. That probably would just change the Earth's climate to the way it is now. But I don't think we want to do this. And the point is, we should not be fatalistic or give up hope about a transition to a world where we can have zero net carbon emissions everywhere.
I spoke to Danny Dorling last week about his book Slow Down. He's quite skeptical of how revolutionary this so-called fourth industrial revolution of AI actually is. He doesn't think that artificial intelligence is very intelligent at all, and it's in fact very artificial. So do you disagree with him on that? Do you think that we are entering a new age?
No, on the whole, I agree with him. I think there is a lot of hype, and I think artificial intelligence can be very helpful in managing complex networks like electricity grids, traffic flows, and incidentally, if the Chinese wanted to have the kind of fully planned economy that Marx could only dream of, they could do that. Because they have monitoring of every financial transaction, a stock in every shop, etc. So it can do things like that. But what it can't do is behave with common sense necessarily, and so it is risky. And so I agree with Danny on this, that we've got to be cautious and not have exaggerated expectations or exaggerated scare stories about what it will do. I think to generalize a bit, if we look at technological progress, it doesn't go steadily. It goes in fits and starts. And if we look at computers and AI, then over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a huge transformation. I mean, a smartphone would have seen magic just 20 years ago, and it's been a huge development. But it may level off, because and it could be that 50 years from now, we'll be using smartphones not very different from the present ones. Let's take an analogy in the news recently, the jumbo jet. The first jumbo jet flight was 50 years ago, and 1971. Okay, and so air travel hasn't changed very much in more than 50 years. Whereas if you go 50 years before that, Alcock and Brown in the first transatlantic flight was about 1920, and so there was huge development in aviation for 50 years, and then a leveling off. And of course, flying is not very different from 50 years ago. Concorde came and went during that period, and of course that may be typical of technologies. And this is Danny's point, that you get a burst of innovation, and then things level off. And of course, he quotes the Robert Gordon book about the fact that probably the technological changes between, say, 1870 and 1950 were more important for people's lives than anything since. So that's a long answer to say that I think we should not extrapolate the present amazingly rapid changes in AI into believing that the machines are going to take over.
And what risks do we face with machine learning?
Well, I mean, I think if we talk about near-term risks, I mean, everyone is now aware that AI can control large data sets, and it learns by looking at a large data set which has been made by humans, and therefore has lots of human biases in it. And so there are lots of well-known examples about this. For instance, some companies have been using AI to do the preliminary sift of the CVs of job applicants. And obviously, if they look into the past evidence of how humans did this, then the humans clearly had biases that we're now more aware of them in the past. And if you just give the computer that data, it'll have the same biases. And so people are now mindful of that sort of thing. And I think there is the point that we've got to be aware that there could be some hidden bugs in the computer. And that's why we should be reluctant to leave to a computer the kind of decisions which affect us, like whether we are denied credit, whether we are recommended for surgery, or whether we are let out of prison if we're in prison. And even if we can be told that on average the machine makes better judgment than an individual human being, that's still not enough, because we're entitled to ask for a reason that we can understand for a decision that affects us. And at the moment, we can't get this from AI. Most people are now aware of these problems, and I think we can improve them, and we can make use of AI. But I think it'll happen slower. For instance, there's now less optimism about fully driverless cars in the next few years, because it's proving very complicated. So, as I say, there will be developments which on the whole would be benign, but they'll happen slower than some of the enthusiasts have been saying in the last few years.
And the popular science writer, historian, you've probably read his work, Yuval Noah Harari. Now, he predicts that in 200 years, there will be no more Homo sapiens. So how plausible do you think a post-human future is?
Well, I mean, this leads to one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, space and space exploration. I mean, I think the short answer to your question is that we will, by the end of the century, I think, have enough knowledge of genetics in understanding the genome and being able to synthesize the genome, and also the possibility of cyborg linking human beings to some plug-in electronics, that we could change human beings substantially. I think this is a reasonable scenario. Despite Danny Dorling, I think you probably agree this is not impossible. Now, I think we are going to want to regulate these things fairly carefully, and on ethical grounds and on prudential grounds. So there'll be regulations. Enforcing the regulations will be hard, of course, just like enforcing the drug laws or the tax laws is pretty hard worldwide. But we're going to. But if I can get onto my topic, I'm often asked about going into space. Will humans go to the moon or Mars, etc.? And my story here is that I think the case for sending people into space, as was done in the past, is getting weaker all the time as robots and miniaturization advance. Robots can do things. They can assemble solar energy collectors and things in space, and they can explore the solar system, etc. So I don't think any taxpayers' money should be spent on sending people into space anymore. It's done for prestige reasons, maybe, but we shouldn't support this. But on the other hand, as you know, it may be possible for private people, SpaceX and Blue Origin and companies like that, to send people into space, and they can do it more cheaply because they can afford to take higher risks than NASA or ESA could impose on publicly funded civilians. And so I think it'll be the private companies taking adventurers who are prepared to accept a high risk, who will be those who will go back to the moon and may one day go to Mars. And it's true, Elon Musk thinks that there may be a million people on Mars by the end of a century. I think that's crazy. And it's very misleading to think that, that ordinary people want to go to Mars. It's far less comfortable than living at the South Pole on top of Everest, and dealing with climate change on the Earth, although we know it's hard, is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. So I disagree with Elon Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking in envisaging mass emigration. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. But having said that, it's quite possible there will be a few adventurers who will be living on Mars by the end of a century. And they will be away from the regulators, and they will have the opportunity and indeed the incentive to use all these new technologies to adapt to a very hostile environment, different gravity, different atmosphere, and all that. And so it's certainly on the cards that within a few centuries, there will be people on Mars who are very different from ordinary human beings. I mean, I hope that these rapid changes can be controlled on the Earth, where we already are fairly adapted. But if there are going to be a few crazy people living out on Mars, then they will want to use all these effects to adapt. And of course, this will be the start of a sort of post-human era, because if they become fully electronic, then they won't need an atmosphere. They may prefer zero gravity, so they can go off into the blue yonder. And if they're near immortal, then a long interstellar voyage is no impediment to them. So I think the idea of post-human exploration beyond our solar system is not crazy if we think on a long time scale. And let's not forget that to all astronomers, we know that the future is longer than the past. We've taken 4 billion years to evolve from the first protozoa, but we shouldn't feel that we're the culmination. The sun's got 6 billion more years. It's less than halfway through its life. So we are in no way the culmination. So lots of things can happen, which you can't possibly predict. So I think that we should, in the long term, envisage that there will be creatures maybe descended from us who are very different from human beings. Whether they be flesh and blood or electronic, we don't know. But going back to Harari, I think he's perhaps wrong in thinking that this will happen on the Earth. Let's hope he's wrong anyway.
So this is a channel about politics. So I'll ask you about democracy. How long do you think democracy's got left?
Well, I think we can't predict because obviously the technologies that we've talked about would have the potential to enhance democracy with appropriate delegation, et cetera, et cetera. But they do, on the other hand, lead to problems. I mean, I think in the short run, there are obvious problems from social media which amplify extremist voices. And I think populism isn't going to be transient. I think it's a consequence of the dominance of the social media, because in the old days, most people got their news filtered through professional journalism, through the big newspapers, etc., which sort of muffled the craziest extremists on the whole. Whereas now, of course, the extremists have a loud voice, and if you click on them, you get sent to something even more extreme. So I think the prevalence of social media is making democracy harder, and certainly eating away at the sort of middle ground, as it were, which makes it hard. So I think to actually have a structure where we can use these technologies to actually enhance rather than disrupt democracy is going to be a big challenge. And that's what you guys have to think about, because it's going to be very hard, but it should be not impossible. But of course, one can't be too optimistic, because it does make governance much harder, of course.
Okay, I appreciate you're really busy, so I won't keep you for too long. I'll just go for two more.
Yes. Can I just say one thing before that? That I think one thing we do have to worry about is not just inequalities within each country, but we have to worry about inequalities across the world. And in particular, I think we have to worry about Africa, because as you know, there are some UN population scenarios that Africa's population may grow, and they may not have the demographic transition, and they may be trapped in poverty, and that's partly because they can't develop the way the Asian tigers did by undercutting manufacturing costs, because robots are doing that, and there's now reshoring, as it were. So they're having a hard time to develop in the way these Asian countries did. And moreover, unlike previous generations in Africa, the one thing they do have is the internet, or access. So they know what they're missing. They know the injustice of their fate. And I think we do have to worry about the global consequences of an Africa with 4 billion people by the end of a century, if they are still trapped in poverty compared to the rest of the world. There'll be clearly massive migration and massive disaffection. So I think there's got to be some mega version of the Marshall Plan, as it were, in order to ensure that Africa doesn't lag behind, because the ladder that allowed the East Asian countries to develop has been kicked away by robotics. So that was a digression, and saying that we've got to be a bit worried about the international polity if inequalities between different domains in the world remain large. And of course, everyone's more aware of them because people can travel more easily and they have information about what they're missing.
What's your greatest fear, Martin Rees?
My greatest fear is of things like I just mentioned, that the world will become unequal and more turbulent, and also that on a small scale there will be frequent disruption. I'm not just thinking of things like pandemics, but there's an arms race now between the cyber attackers and the cybersecurity people, and it's clear that the stakes are getting higher. And I think we do have to worry about the risk of massive disruptions of say the things we depend on, especially if we live in cities, because we're getting more fragile, since we're not self-sufficient, and a city couldn't exist for more than a few days without lapsing into anarchy if the electricity went off. The lights going out is the least of one's problems. Everything else would fail. There'd be no food, no anything. And so we do have to worry about avoiding a situation where there are recurrent events of that kind. And also, we have to worry about pandemics because, as I said in my book, it's not like the Black Death, where half the population of some cities, or some towns anyway, died, and the rest just went on fatalistically. If the number of cases overwhelmed hospitals, there'd be social breakdown. And that would happen before even 1% of people were threatened with a fatal illness. So we are much more vulnerable. And so I do worry about whether we can maintain social stability in the face of all these potential risks. And that's why, to go back to the beginning, it's very important that we should be maximally prepared and, as it were, pay insurance premiums and arrange so that we can minimize the dangers and redirect technology in benign ways so as to minimize these chances. And if I can say one final thing, which is that everyone says we need more long-term thinking, and we do, because the problem in climate change policy, of course, is that the worst effects are going to be not in the next decade, but in the second half of the century. And it's very hard to get people to make sacrifices now for the benefit of generations as yet unborn and people in different parts of the world. And there's a paradox, which I mentioned in my book, which is that we have less cathedral thinking than in the past. I mean, I think about what I mentioned, particularly Ely Cathedral, which is near where we both live. If you think of the people who built that, they had limited horizons. The Fens were their world. They knew nothing beyond Europe. But they built this cathedral. It wasn't finished in their lifetime, and it still inspires us nearly a millennium later. And now, despite our vastly greater horizons in both space and time, we don't plan ahead and think long term. Now, at first sight, this is a paradox, but it's not a paradox. The reason is that those who built Ely Cathedral, they may have thought the world would only last 1,000 years, but they thought the lives of their children and their grandchildren would be the same as theirs. So their grandchildren would appreciate the cathedral when it was finished, even if they didn't. Whereas now, I don't think we can be at all confident about the lifestyles and the predicament of people sort of 30 or 60 or 100 years from now. And that is one reason, I think, why we are less willing to plan for the long term. But this is an acute issue in the context of climate change. And I think it's very important that people should realize that you shouldn't apply the standard economic discount rate as people like Vaughan Lomberg do, you know, the way you discount everything, what happens after 2050, because young people today will be alive at the end of a century, and we ought to care about them. And just as we have benefited from the heritage of centuries past, what the Victorians did, and certainly in the 20th century, we ought to do something to ensure that the people alive in the 21st century, many of whom are already born, don't have a depleted legacy from our generation.
Okay, I'll finish with this one. So in November 2019, you gave a TED talk that had the title of "Is This Our Final Century?" Now, how optimistic are you that this won't be our final century and humanity has got much more left in it?
Yes. Well, it won't be the end of humanity, but the question is, will it be a century which ends more happily than it began or not? I think that's a genuine question. Will the amazing advance in technology be deployed as they could be, to provide a life at least as good as we now have for everyone in the world. That could happen, or will they lead to massive disruptions so that life is not better? So I think there's the stakes are higher than ever before, simply because the power of technology is higher than before. So the key thing is to challenge those who are in charge of how technology is used to make sure that we can harness the benefits while minimizing the downsides. That's the new feature of this century.